And I can tell you, it is the same story all over again. You're up against the lobby, right? The lobby works behind the scenes to put enormous pressure on media figures and on politicians and on policymakers.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Judge Napolitano's show to talk about how propaganda led to this latest war in Iran between Israel and Iran, with the U.S. supporting Israel as always. He also gets into whether other countries will join this scuffle, so I want to hear from him, so let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
What are the likely consequences of an American attack from the perspective of the Kremlin?
Well, I think the Kremlin has a vested interest in seeing this war shut down. I think Putin has made it clear that he would like to shut the war down. I think the Kremlin is worried about Iran. I think that the Kremlin is closely allied with Iran and China, and they do not want to see Iran defeated. And I would imagine that people in the Kremlin, people like Putin, worry about that, but they don't have to worry. That's my argument. I think the Chinese have a vested interest in seeing this war go on. This is not to say that they are extremely happy about that situation, but I think the Chinese understand that the Americans are they're burning up valuable assets in this war that are otherwise needed to contain China in East Asia. You do not want to underestimate the negative consequences of what we're doing on Israel's behalf for our situation in the Pacific. The United States has been pinned down for a long time in both Ukraine and the Middle East, which makes it very difficult for us to pivot to East Asia. And this conflict now, as it heats up and puts greater and greater demands on American military assets, is a nightmare for the purposes of containing China. By the way, you want to remember here, this is a very important point. We fought a 30-day war against the Houthis. You remember when President Trump declared war against the Houthis? And
right. Was there unconditional surrender then?
No. After 30 days, we quit. Right. And by the way, the main reason we quit is that we were burning up valuable ammunition that we didn't want to burn up. And it was all to no effect because we were not defeating the Houthis. But I would ask you this question. If we couldn't beat the Houthis, why do you think that either we or the Israelis can bring Iran to its knees?
Yeah, good question there by Mearsheimer. So, Trump made a big show about shutting down the bombing in Yemen after that signal leak, and kind of the fallout that happened from that came to a halt with firing Waltz, shutting that down. But Mearsheimer's probably right about the armaments. Also, I think he's generally right about what this does to the Russian relationship and the Chinese relationship and how they're looking at this war. Iran is a closer ally to Russia than it is to China, and they're a BRICS country, so they're in the BRICS alliance. But this, more importantly, jeopardizes the hopes and aspirations of the U.S. to establish what other semblance there are of them left, to establish peace in Ukraine. And a lot of Trump's policies, in my estimation, haven't really gone far enough to do that. You don't even really have to negotiate an end to the war. You would guarantee an end to the war if you shut down aid to Ukraine, which Trump won't do. He did do that for 6 or 7 days. Then he restored it quickly for, this facade minerals deal and ceasefire, both of which went nowhere. And the minerals deal was absurd because it laid claim to minerals that were mostly in the east and in the Donbass that Russia occupies. So I'm with Mearsheimer here. He's right.
Do you foresee a circumstance under which the Russians or the Chinese would get involved militarily?
No. If you're talking about them getting directly involved in the fight, absolutely not. If you're talking about them providing support for Iran, economic support, military support, and diplomatic support, I'd say the answer is certainly yes. These four countries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, all have a vested interest in hanging together because they understand they're basically up against the United States, Israel, and Ukraine. And there's no way they can let their guard down. They have to support each other. But at the same time, I don't see the Russians or the Chinese getting into the fight. And by the way, as I'm saying here, there's no need for them to get into the fight, because I think the Iranians can take care of themselves, especially if China and Russia are to provide aid, military aid and economic aid.
Yeah, totally agree. Iran is their proxy now, the BRICS countries' proxy, just like Ukraine is the proxy of NATO and the United States. So this is the precedent now that we live in this age of a new Cold War, where we're just funding proxy wars across the world. The Alternative Alliance responds by funding their own proxy wars, and this is going to be one where both sides fund respective proxies that are battling each other, and both indirectly part of this war, but not directly in terms of a hot war. I think that's likely, and I sure hope that it's likely that the U.S. doesn't get involved. I mean, that's always a possibility, but right now we're not seeing that yet, but it could cause catastrophe if that happens.
What role might the Pakistanis play if the Ayatollah is assassinated, or if Trump drops the 30,000-pound bombs, if something dramatic like either of those events happens?
I think the only plausible scenario, and it's barely plausible, is one where where Israel uses nuclear weapons against Iran. The question you want to ask yourself moving forward is that if I'm correct that Israel is in real trouble and the Israelis are in desperate straits, will they turn to nuclear weapons to deal with Iran's nuclear infrastructure? And I think that's possible. I do not think it's likely, but it's possible. And you're seeing more and more talk of it in the media. And by the way, as the situation continues to deteriorate in this fight for Israel, there'll be more and more talk about using nuclear weapons. And then the question becomes, what will Pakistan do? I don't think it would launch a nuclear war on behalf of Iran or any other country, because that would be suicidal. But there is talk that the Pakistanis might give a bomb to the Iranians or give a bomb to the Turks if they needed it.
Yeah, that's a big fear. There are some cultural divides, though, between Pakistan and Iran, although both are Muslim nations. Pakistan is predominantly Sunni, and Iran is predominantly Shia, and that's a big dividing line in most Muslim countries. But that is a fear, that Pakistan, as a nuclear power, could give a nuclear weapon to a different country, maybe Iran, maybe it gets into the hands of a different Muslim nation in the region that wants to use it against Israel in this scenario in which, we're facing a nuclear war. Let's all pray and hope that that doesn't happen. But there are regional concerns here and dynamics that some people aren't really looking at, and Pakistan's role is probably one of those.
So all bets could be off then. And you do want to remember, this is a sort of a separate, but not really separate point, that all of what is taking place is having hugely negative consequences for the non-proliferation regime. First of all, you're giving the Iranians powerful incentives to go out and get nuclear weapons.
Right.
Moreover, you're sending a powerful signal to virtually every other country on the planet that might view itself as an adversary of the United States or Israel to make sure it has nuclear weapons. And this is just disastrous. And furthermore, what does Israeli behavior and American behavior these days say about our respect for international law? It says that we don't pay any attention to international law unless we think it's in our interest. So I think in terms of the proliferation regime, which has been very successful at curbing proliferation since it was set up in the late 60s and early 70s, this is bad news.
Yeah, Mearsheimer's correct. Look at this twisted incentive structure that the U.S. has created for the rest of the world. Because of the deeds of the U.S., it only serves as an incentive for countries to acquire nuclear weapons that are on the brink of it, possibly willing to develop them or are on the track to developing them now. And just look at two examples to prove this. North Korea, they acquired nuclear weapons, and regime change is essentially off the table. Almost no one talks about it anymore. Even the hawkest of hawks, the biggest neocons in the world, compared to what Gaddafi did. He gave up his nuclear weapons program in the mid-2000s, and you saw what happened to him. He got toppled in a coup led by the US and NATO, and his regime was overthrown. So what does that say to the rest of the world? I can assure you that the rest of the world was watching those things unfold. And, you know, even if you told me that Iran did have a nuclear weapon, it actually makes the case for war against Iran much worse. But if they don't have one, it makes it look like it's propaganda saying that they have one to try to drum us up to war. So you can see why Netanyahu and why the neocons and why the Zionists have always said, you know, they're on the brink of a nuclear weapon. For 30 years they've said that, longer in some cases. But for 30 years, almost my entire life, they're 6 weeks away, they're 2 months away, they're 6 months away, etc. On and on and on and on, is because you drum up the fear that they're going to get one soon. But the moment they get one, no one's going to want to go to war with them for obvious reasons. Nuclear retaliation is nothing to, you know, chuckle at. That is serious business. There's no left or right. There's no culture. There's no economy. There's nothing in a nuclear winter. We don't want to experience that.
Put it mildly.
Professor Mearsheimer, shouldn't there be a great debate in America about the nature and extent of our involvement in a war that could be as disastrous as is happening? Why should a person who changes his mind every 10 minutes meet in a windowless room with 5 people, tell him what he wants to hear, make this decision, rather than great debates on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate about the role of America in the world, and we really want to kill Iranians?
Oh, it's very simple. You can't have a great debate on any issue involving Israel. It's just impermissible. The lobby won't allow it, and all the lobby's cutouts. You see them in the Senate, you see them in the House, you see them in the media. These cutouts working with the lobby will not allow us to have a debate. And the reason that they won't allow us to have a debate is it won't come out in Israel's favor. You want to understand that the main reason that we have an Israel lobby that goes to enormous lengths to shut down discourse about Israel and to smear anyone who is critical of Israel, to ruin their career, is because if you had an open discourse, Israel would come out on the losing side.
Yeah, totally. And especially topics related to Israel and war, because Americans are not likely to support wars, especially after all we've been through in the last few decades. You know, there was war propaganda that won over a large swath of Americans. I think a majority of Americans in the run up to the Iraq war, for sure. But people have been so duped, and see how this plays out in so many cases. In Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, etc., on and on and on. Ukraine, and now we're talking about Iran, that Israel's always wanted the U.S. to get involved in. No neocon, even the strictest and most hawkish neocons, campaigned on bombing Iran, enacting regime change in Iran. Some of them have said that from time to time, but they're not stupid enough to run on that because they know their home constituencies don't support that. But their real constituencies do support that. And who is that? The Israel lobby, the military-industrial complex. Those vermin, those villains that want to get us embroiled in another war. It's catastrophic. It always is. This scenario is most likely to be one that is horrific for the United States. It's one we can't take, and Mearsheimer's exactly right. No debate is going to happen. This is bipartisanism. This is the uniparty at its worst, always funding Israel. You want to talk this left-right polarization divide? There's really not that much polarization on Israel. It's just the truth. There are some outliers like Thomas Massey, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, and some others that will not support Israel at all costs, but they are few and far between.
I want to play. You alluded to this earlier, and a lot of these you're familiar with. These are instances of Prime Minister Netanyahu in various venues, testifying before Congress, speaking before the United Nations, addressing a joint session of Congress, claiming that Iran is within months, or perhaps his word, possibly his word, weeks of having a nuclear weapon. This is a CNN montage. It's very effective. Watch this.
The deadline for attaining this goal is getting extremely close. And Iran, by the way, is also outpacing Iraq in the development of ballistic missile systems that they hope will reach the eastern seaboard of the United States within 15 years. By next spring, at most, by next summer,
this is my favorite one.
Rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb.
It's a bomb graphic. It's so ridiculous. This propaganda is so transparent every time.
Foremost sponsor of global terrorism could be weeks away from having enough enriched uranium for an entire arsenal of nuclear weapons. That would place a militant Islamic terror regime weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months, less than a year.
This needs to be refuted. Certainly the last statement that he made needs to be refuted in a public forum. But he's not the only one here. I'm going to play another one for you. This is the George W. Bush, Colin Powell lead up to the invasion of Iraq. History is repeating itself.
Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small.
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions.
Oh, yeah.
What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. Saddam
Really
Hussein and his
solid.
regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
They have ballistic missiles that can now reach deep into Europe and soon could reach the United States. You want these people to have nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them to your cities? Today it's Tel Aviv, tomorrow it's New York.
Same.
That's the craziest propaganda. I have to pause it there because the propaganda is leading you to believe that a mushroom cloud's going to appear over New York City. Iran, even if you entertain the notion that they have a nuclear weapon, they would need a delivery system to fire that upon us from a nuclear submarine or an aircraft carrier or a land outlet that's in the vicinity, and they don't have that capacity whatsoever. Even if you look at the radiuses that they show in the alarming Iranian propaganda showing how they can hit Israel and all that, which obviously they can, and that's why it was bad for Israel to strike them, it doesn't even, flirt with the notion that it can deliver a nuke across the sea into the U.S. It's insane.
Thing over and over and over again.
Listen, I was one of the principal public opponents of the Iraq War before it happened on March 19th, 2003. I wrote op-eds in the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune. I helped pay for an ad on the op-ed page of the New York Times.
This is when your humble host here first learned of and began admiring you.
Thank you. And I can tell you, it is the same story all over again. You're up against the lobby, right? The lobby works behind the scenes to put enormous pressure on media figures and on politicians and on policymakers to support these crazy wars. And people who have facts and logic on their side can barely get a hearing. It's really quite remarkable. It was easier to get something of a hearing back then than it is now. The situation has only deteriorated with time, in large part because the lobby has gotten more powerful. But here we are again. And, for people like me, the mainstream media has no use for us. And thank goodness we have shows like yours, because it's, the only way the word gets out.
Yeah, the propaganda machine is on overload right now. We're seeing kind of the same strategies play out right now as they did in 2002 and 2003. I know if you're watching this and you lived through that, I bet you're nodding right now. There's so many similarities, weapons of mass destruction. Just replace that with nuclear weapons. The U.S. could be imperiled. This is a terrorist regime. They haven't disarmed. All that crap that you heard back then is being redeployed right now, just tuned in a new way, manifesting against Iran and also on behalf of Israel, like all these terror wars usually are in the Middle East. Israel pulled us into virtually the entire thing outside of Afghanistan. And if the U.S. gets totally embroiled in it, it could be as bad of an outcome as Iraq, Libya, Syria. I think it would be guaranteed to be worse than Libya, and probably worse than them all, because Iran has far greater technology in terms of weaponry, a larger populace, probably a more solidified and stronger government. And, it really would be catastrophic to launch a new invasion, especially with ground forces. And man, I hope the U.S. does not bomb Iran, because it will imperil all of the U.S. troops in the region, of which there are many. There are about 40 to 45,000 if you consider contractors, plus naval resources that are in Bahrain and off the coast of Bahrain. And I believe that news hit yesterday that Trump is moving some of the aircraft carriers and vessels and resources into that region from elsewhere. So this could be alarming. Let's hope that peace prevails as always.
Chris, do we still have Anthony Wedgwood Benn, the 2-minute version, not the intro or the follow-up, just Anthony Wedgwood Benn on the floor of the House of Commons? You probably remember him. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. A great 2-minute closing argument against the Tony Blair government joining George Bush's invasion. Of course, he lost that debate, but here's what he said.
I finish just by saying this. War is an easy thing to talk about. There are not many people of the generation that remember it. The right honourable gentleman served with distinction in the last war. I never killed anyone, but I wore uniform. But I was in London in the Blitz in 1940, living in the Millbank Tower where I was born. Some different ideas have come in since. And every night I went down to the shelter in Thames House. Every morning I saw Dockland burning. 500 people were killed in Westminster one night by a landmine. It was terrifying. Aren't Arabs terrified? Aren't Iraqis terrified? Don't Arab and Iraqi women weep when their children die? Doesn't bombing strengthen their determination? What fools we are to live in a generation for which war is a computer game for our children and just an interesting little Channel 4 news item. Every member of Parliament tonight who votes for the government motion will be consciously and deliberately accepting the responsibility for the deaths of innocent people if the war begins, as I fear it will. Now, that's for their decision to take. But this is a quite unique debate in my parliamentary experience, where we're asked to share responsibility for a decision we won't really be taking, with consequences for people who have no part to play in the brutality of the regime which we are dealing with. And I finish with this. On October the 24th, 1945, and the former Prime Minister from Bexley, Old Sidcup, will remember it, the United Nations Charter was passed. And the words of that charter etched into my mind and move me even as I think of them. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save future generations, succeeding generations, from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering to mankind. That was the pledge of that generation to this generation, and it would be the greatest betrayal of all if we voted to abandon the Charter and take unilateral action and pretend we were doing it in the name of the international community. And I shall vote against the motion for the reasons that I've given them.
Powerful speech. That's certainly a scourge against the war machine, if I ever heard one. That's, pretty compelling, I have to say. I actually hadn't seen that before. Maybe some of you remember that, though.
Hard to imagine that Thomas Massey or Rand Paul or even Bernie Sanders would be permitted to make arguments like that on the floor of the House or the Senate.
Well, they probably would be permitted, but they would be assaulted, verbally assaulted afterwards, and everybody would go after them hammer and tong, as is so often the case. I would also note, just to add to what Mr. Benn said, that after World War II, it was not only the scourge of war that we were trying to eliminate, it was the scourge of genocide. And we don't want to lose sight of the fact that while this war between Iran and Israel is being waged. A genocide is taking place in Gaza on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I think that's one big reason for this war, that Netanyahu wants to take geopolitical eyes, so to speak, off of what's happening in Gaza, focus them on Iran, so he can do whatever he wants there. And obviously he intervened in Iran because he wanted to kind of tank the U.S. negotiations. To the extent that Trump was involved in that tanking is still a matter of debate. It seems plausible that he was involved, at least at the very end, because the U.S. very abruptly switched from a negotiation strategy of preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons and shutting down that program for good and allowing inspections, and then abruptly shifting to, hey, you can't enrich uranium at all. And that's a dead letter. That was a non-starter from the start because it would have prevented Iran from even having nuclear energy. So, yeah, that's where we are right now. The Israel lobby is powerful, and what can we say?
And we're continuing to fund Ukraine on a daily basis. Let's not lose sight of that. So the president of peace is funding genocide in Gaza and a losing effort in Ukraine, and is acting like Hamlet with respect to, or wants us to think he's acting like Hamlet with respect to Iran. Who knows how this will end? What are your last thoughts on this, Professor Mearsheimer?
Well, my last thoughts are I hope there's some way that this can be brought to an end. I hope Trump has the good sense not to take the United States into this war. And I hope that the fact that he's not been talking so hawkishly the past 2 days means that he's beginning to see the light. And then I hope he goes to great lengths to get the Israelis and the Iranians to do something to bring this to an end. Am I hopeful that will happen? No, but that's sort of the best case I can make at this point in time.
Yeah, I agree with him, man. With every word of that finality, every word of that conclusion, every word of that soliloquy at the end, totally agree with Mearsheimer. And I'm, too, not that hopeful that the U.S. is going to stay out, stay out to the extent that it's even possible at this point, supporting Israel. Also, the Israel lobby is powerful. Mearsheimer is right. He literally wrote the book on it. It's called The Lobby. Excellent book. I really recommend checking out. He wrote that with a co-author, and I always feel guilty when I bring it up because I forget who that is, his co-author on that. But that's a superb book. Very good. And we've only learned more about the power of the Israel lobby since. We're learning more and more about it every day. In fact, today, Tulsi Gabbard tweeted that people were twisting her testimony to Congress in March about the fact that there's no evidence that Iran started their nuclear program since it was dismantled in 2003, or that Iran's on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon. She now said today on Twitter that they're weeks away, just out of the blue today. It literally came out of nowhere. That's more radical than even what Netanyahu himself has said or Mossad has said. So it seems like she's complicit or compromised by the Israel lobby herself, at least partially contradicting what she said in that report. So that's where we're at right now. Whether the U.S. gets completely sucked in or not, we might not know. It might happen this weekend. This video should come out during the weekend. You'll see, I guess, and I'll be waiting with bated breath, praying for peace and hoping for, reason to prevail in this whole madness. But I do want to hear from what you guys think. Do you think the U.S. will get sucked in more directly to this war, whether it be military strikes, boots on the ground, etc.? Let me know in the comments below. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and please consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron. That would do a lot to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.